Hello, my name is Dr. Sabina Akram, and thank you for listening to this pre-recorded talk, A Woman's Worth, Exploring the Gender Divide in Pakistani Culture, which is part of South Asian History Month. I want to start by just giving you a little background about myself. I'm the youngest of five, and I was born to first-generation Pakistani immigrants. My dad came to this country during post-war immigration and after the partition of India in the 1960s. Pakistan was a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, and England needed workers to rebuild the economy, and so my grandfather and my dad arrived in England. With them, they also brought the traditions they were used to in Pakistan, traditions and customs that were practiced by their parents and their parents before them, and some of them which included women marrying to become housewives, having children and raising them while the men went out to work. This Victorian separate spheres ideology is still in place in Pakistan today, and even in some parts of the UK, within many British Pakistani Muslim households. I recently had a conversation with my dad about this, and he said something that I never thought of before. He said that he was caught between tradition and modernity. He was 12 years old, moving to another country where he didn't speak the language and had to attend secondary school. He would sit there day in, day out, not understanding what anyone was saying, but expected to learn the material without any help from the teachers. But he kept going every day, and eventually he learnt the language. He began to like this new world, but at the same time he started to conform to his parents' expectations, and he didn't want to disappoint his dad, my grandfather, who was working endlessly in a chicken factory to make ends meet. My dad went to college and eventually became a motor vehicle mechanic. And when he was 19 years old, his parents told him the time had come to get married. And off he went to Pakistan where a match was arranged with my mother. He did this because it was the custom, the thing to do, and he didn't want to be the one to bring shame upon his family if he didn't do what everybody else was doing, the cultural standard. And it is this feeling, this not wanting to disappoint your parents, that still lives on today in regards to marriage. Pakistan has become a focal point of many British Pakistani lives, and you'll understand why as this talk goes on. So this got me thinking, and I started researching just how much culture differs from religion itself. So to give you some context, what is Pakistani culture and what is being a Muslim? In December 2019, the World Economic Forum published its Global Gender Gap Index report, which ranks countries with respect to gender disparity. Pakistan ranked 151 out of 157 countries. What are the drivers of such gender disparities? Research has highlighted several factors, such as individual characteristics, social norms, and economical deprivations. However, the failure of the state is the most critical reason behind gender disparity. Why does the state directly and indirectly create and aggravate gender disparities? In Pakistan, a clear manifestation of gender disparity is the preference for the sons. This is an age-old norm with roots in the distant past. Discrimination against women continues to take many forms. For example, sons getting quality education while daughters end up in low-quality schools or no schools at all is a common form of discrimination. The problem arises primarily from unequal power relations. Power is the ability to influence or control the behaviors of others. Now, economic independence is the most obvious measure of power, and this is why vast majority of women in Pakistan are economically dependent on men, for example, their fathers, their brothers, their husbands, and their sons. But what does this have to do with British Pakistani Muslim women living in the UK today? What does this have to do with me or many women like me? We're not financially dependent on men, although my dad would probably disagree with that point. But if British Pakistani women, Muslim women, aren't relying on men for economic dependence, then why are we still facing discrimination in various forms if we're not married by a certain age or choosing to remain single? It is important to understand that the religion of Islam and people's cultural traditions are two very different factors. A major pitfall for practitioners is confusing cultural practices with religious beliefs. Many make the mistake of assuming that all of the Muslim manners and practices are related to Islam. In fact, many Muslims are heavily influenced by the individual cultural backgrounds. Islam is an extremely cultural, diverse religion. British Muslims alone hail from countries all over, from Africa, Middle East, Asia, Europe, and many are born in the United Kingdom with a variety of ethnic backgrounds. Now, within this umbrella term of Pakistani Muslim, you then have several cultural identifications. You have Punjabis, Mirpuris, Gujaratis, Kashmiris, and these are defined from the geographical location you're from in Pakistan. Therefore, a lot of our understanding of what we perceive to be Islam is in fact shaped by our cultural traditions. These traditions transcend from your place of origin. Therefore, a lot of second generation Pakistani Muslims like me, who were brought up by those arriving in the UK, still set in their cultural and societal norms. For example, in Islam, Muslims have some very simple rites for welcoming a child into this world, and one of which is when a baby's first taste should be something sweet. So parents may chew a piece of a date and rub the juice against the baby's gums. It is a practice carried out by the Prophet Muhammad, and it is believed to help tiny digestive systems to kick in. Now, this applies to all babies regardless of their sex. However, gender difference is evident right from birth within Pakistani culture. When a boy is born, traditional sweets like mithai, that is the word for the sweets, are distributed to the local community to celebrate such a joyous occasion. It is to celebrate the birth of a boy, a child who's to become a man and take on the family name. However, the same act of elation is not repeated if you were to give birth to a baby girl. No sweets, no celebration, nothing. From this simple act, a girl is inferior from birth. When my niece was born in 2005, I decided to set free this foolish tradition of masculinity and wanted to order 200 sweet boxes to distribute in the community. 200 being because Pakistanis know a lot of people. I was not going to let my own niece be inferior at birth. In my eyes, every child matters regardless of sex. When I told my parents about this, my parents said that this wasn't the thing to do in the community, so with regret, I had to let the matter go. 2 years later, in 2007, my nephew was born. My parents phoned the mithai shop, the sweet shop, to place an order. I was not happy, so I, stubbornly, and for the people who know me, they'll know I can be quite stubborn, placed an order for the same amount of mithai, and I said to my parents that I want to send the mithai I ordered for my niece who was born 2 years ago. I explained to them that if we didn't change this silly gender disparity at birth, then nothing would ever change. I told them that just because you're a girl, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter that you're any different to a man, to a boy. Now, my parents knew this and agreed with me on all points, but their primary concern had always been, what would the community say? But this time, my parents supported me, and it was worth it just to see the utter shock on these people's faces when my mother and I showed up with 2 mithai boxes, one for my nephew and one for my niece, who was born earlier, 2 years earlier. When my parents' third grandchild was born in 2008, a little baby girl, this time my parents phoned the mithai shop straight away without any prompting from me. 4 granddaughters and 3 grandsons later, my parents gave him a Thai box every time. And at the time, we were seen as the odd family for celebrating the birth of a girl. But the funny thing is, 4 years after my niece was born, we received a mithai box celebrating the birth of a child in the Pakistani community. And who was it for? Their granddaughter. As time went on, more mithai boxes were given out for the birth of girls in our community. The point of this is nobody wants to be the first to do something different. Nobody wants to break traditions. But as this story proves, traditions can be changed, and when they are, people soon follow. We are subjected to religion through a cultural lens, and the only way to ensure full participation of women globally is by, to a certain extent, reclaiming religion. Growing up, I remember one incident when I was 14 years old. I had gone to my friend's house and we decided to walk to the local Rainbow. And if you're old enough to remember the supermarket chain Rainbow, then well done. I didn't see this as a good thing. I didn't see this as a bad thing. To me, I was going for a walk with some friends and getting some sweets. My mum's friend's son saw me, and when he looked at me at 14 years old, I felt that I did something wrong, a feeling from a look. By the time I went home later that day, upon entering the house, my sister told me that my mum's friend had come round to tell my mum that I was seen walking with my friends in the Rainbow. To me, this sounded ludicrous. Someone had gone out of their way to come round to my parents' house to tell my mum that her 14-year-old daughter was walking back from the supermarket, armed with sweets and accompanied by people like hold the front page. My mum asked me if I had gone to Rainbow and I replied yes. She was not happy. I asked her why and she replied because girls shouldn't be out without supervision and you got caught. The word caught threw me. Like I had been caught in a compromising situation. I had only walked to the shops. I then looked at her as something hit me. Well, why was her son, my mum's friend's son that is, going to the shop by himself? Her response? Because he's a man. This is one of the earliest memories of thinking, why am I being treated differently because I'm a girl? Now, a lot has happened since then. I don't blame my parents for thinking what they did back then. They raised us the way they were raised, the way that they knew how. While today my parents are my biggest supporters, my sisters and I have to fight against the cultural norms and talk about uncomfortable things that my parents were not ready to hear in order for change to take place, in order for them to break away from their parents' way of thinking and discover their own mind to respect our decisions. Last year, one of my mum's friends, came to the house. I happened to be walking through the living room where they were both sat. The woman turned around to my mum and said, "What does your youngest daughter do?" And my mum, all proud, smiling, replied, "She has just got her PhD and is teaching." The woman asked my age and then said, "Is she not married?" Married, even. This time, there was no unhappiness on my mum's behalf. She simply said, "That's her decision, and if she wants to marry, that's her choice." I remember thinking two things. Firstly, how far my mum had come in her thinking, and secondly, I had a PhD and I was economically independent and happy, so why was this not being celebrated? At the age of last year when I was 32, why was my age such a big thing? Why instead was this woman disregarding all of that I had a PhD that was economically independent? Like being married would somehow fulfill the package. Why does this woman think this? Did Islam really think women were second-class citizens who needed to be married in order to be complete? This is what I started thinking at the time. And I went on to research this and started asking myself, what is the position of women in Islam exactly? So saying that, what does Islam really say about women? In order to answer this question, I looked at women in Islam and began to understand that the misrepresentation, misuse, and manipulation of religious scripture have influenced greatly our social and cultural norms. I started to learn about women leaders who were innovative and strong politically, economically, and even militarily. So why do we not learn about these women? My first example for this would be Hawa, which is Eve. The Quranic narration of Adam and Hawwa's creation and fall differs thematically from the more Jewish and Christian traditions. Similar to the Christian and Jewish tale, Allah created Adam and Hawwa and a place for them to live, paradise. However, in the Quran, Hawwa's role is minimal as she is an accomplice to human sin rather than the instigator. It is Adam who was forewarned by Allah that Iblis, Satan, is their natural enemy and the threat to their removal from heaven. In the Quran it says, "So we said, O Adam, this is an enemy to you and to your wife. Therefore let him not drive you both from the garden so that you should be unhappy." The literal Quranic text in many ways removes the blame that is often placed upon Eve. Instead of being portrayed as the cause of Adam's fall, Hawa is merely presented as equally compliant in the sin, and then later equally compliant in the punishment and atonement. Further to this, the Quran does not mention anything explicit with regards to Hawa being created from the rib of Adam. Rather, it states, "And from amongst his signs is that he created for you mates from among yourselves, so that you may dwell in tranquility with them." Many scholars interpret the phrase "from amongst yourselves" to mean that Hawa was created from the rib of Adam, yet several others interpret that phrase "from amongst yourselves" as meaning from the same species, that is, human mates. My second example is Khadija. So Khadija was Muhammad's first wife, and in my view, Islam's first feminist. She was a successful businesswoman and who turned down many proposals of marriage, and it was her. She was the one that asked Muhammad to marry her. She was 15 years older than Muhammad, and she was the first Muslim convert. And she also financed the Islamic movement in its infancy. Thirdly, Aisha, Muhammad's wife again, she led an army in the Battle of Basra. Okay, so this is a woman, a Muslim woman, who led an army of men in the Battle of Basra. We then have Warqa. She was a female companion of the Prophet Muhammad. She was appointed female imam by Muhammad to lead prayers. Now, the Quran does not address the issue of women imams. Relevant predecessors are often sought for in the Hadith, the traditions attributed to Muhammad, which are a record of the words, actions, and the silent approval of the Islamic prophet Muhammad himself. It is a source of religious law and moral guidance ranked second only to that of the Quran. Now, Warqa was instructed by Muhammad to lead al-Dahiya, which consists of both men and women in prayer. Now, the Arabic phrase means the people of her home, but the ambiguity hangs on the exact translation of dah, meaning home, which can refer to one's residence, neighborhood, or village. The people of Warqa's home. Now, Warqa was one of the few to hand down the Quran before it was recorded in writing, and she could do so because she had memorized the entire text. The use of the word da in the Hadith, when speaking of where the prayer was held, has resulted in different interpretations. A general translation is area, constituting the community around where she lived. This idea is not accepted by many scholars. Another translation of da is household, which would mean that Warqa led prayers in her home. And if she did that, who was she leading? The example of Warqa serves as the basis for the opinion among some Islamic jurists that women are permitted to not only lead other women in prayer, but that they may also lead mixed-sex congregations. However, this has also prompted others to argue that a woman can only do so if she leads from behind the male congregation, does not beautify her voice, and that there is no man available with any knowledge of the Quran, and that she leaves them in a nafil, which is an optional prayer, and not a mandatory prayer, a fajr, based on all the meaning of and that's all based on the meaning of the word da. Next, we have Fatima Jinnah. Now, in modern Muslim history, there are examples of strong women, but yet again, they are not given much thought. Fatima Jinnah was a successful dentist and a member of the All Indian Muslim League, and fought alongside her brother Muhammad Ali Jinnah for freedom against the British Empire. She campaigned for equal opportunities for women, citing that both genders working equally will make Pakistan an honourable country against its nations. She even contested the 1965 presidential election, being the first woman ever to do so. She fought valiantly for the cause of democracy and human rights in Pakistan. Yet, Muhammad Ali Jinnah is the only one considered as founding Pakistan after the partition in 1947. He is the only one talked about, and it is his photo that is the only one placed in many Muslim households to honour his commitment to the Pakistani people, even though his sister did as much as him. Next, Benazir Bhutto. She served as the Prime Minister of Pakistan from 1988 to 1999, and again from 1995 to 1996. She was the first woman to lead democratic government in a Muslim-majority nation. Ideologically, she was a liberal. She chaired and co-chaired the Pakistan People's Party from the early 1980s until her assassination in 2007. She was born into a politically important, wealthy family, and her father, the PPP's founder and leader Zulfikar, was elected prime minister on a socialist platform in 1973. Bhutto studied at Harvard University and the University of Oxford, and after her father was ousted in a military coup and executed in 1977, Bhutto took control of the Pakistan People's Party and led the country's movement for the restoration of democracy. She was repeatedly imprisoned for doing so. She transformed the PPP's platform from a socialist to a liberal one before leading it to a victory in 1988 in the election. Now, as Prime Minister, her attempts to reform were stifled by conservative and Islamist forces, including the opposition and the powerful military. Her second term oversaw economic privatization and attempts to advance women's rights, and but her government was damaged by several controversies, including the assassination of her brother, a failed 1995 coup, and a bribery scandal involving her and her husband. Her government was again dismissed and she went into self-exile before returning to Pakistan in 2007 to compete in the 2008 elections. Her platform emphasized civilian oversight of the military and opposition to growing Islamic violence. After a political rally in Rawalpindi, she was assassinated. Now, the jihadi group Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for this, although the involvement of the Pakistani Taliban and rogue elements of the intelligence services are also widely suspected to be involved. She was a controversial figure. She was often criticized as being politically inexperienced and corrupt, and faced much opposition from Pakistan's Islamic lobby for her modernizing agenda. In the early years of her career, she was nonetheless domestically popular and attracted support as she was championing democracy. Most of her time in power was spent battling for survival against those who opposed her, including the then presidents of the country, who were constantly trying to bring down her government. Benazir faced constant character assassination, constant resilience from the mullahs who would try to stir up the public by proclaiming that a government headed by a woman was un-Islamic, and persistent refusal by army generals to salute a female prime minister. Yet she managed to leave behind a legacy of commitment to democracy, economic empowerment of the downtrodden, and social equality, despite being surrounded in a male-dominated society. Now finally, Asma Jahangir. Now, this was somebody, ashamedly, I didn't know about and only came across in my research. She was a Pakistani human rights lawyer and a social activist who co-founded and chaired the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. She became a democracy advocate and was, like Benazir Bhutto, imprisoned in 1983 for participating in the movement of the restoration of democracy against the military regime. She became Pakistan's first woman to serve as the president of the Supreme Court Bar Association. She spent her career defending the human and women's rights of religious minorities and children in Pakistan, and in 1980, alongside her sister Hina, together with fellow activists and lawyers, they formed the first law firm established by women in Pakistan. In the same year, they also helped form the Women's Action Forum, a pressure group campaigning against Pakistan's discriminatory legislation, most notably against the proposed law of evidence, where the value of women's testimonies was reduced to half that of a man's testimony, and the Hudud Ordinance, where victims of rape had to prove their innocence or else face punishment themselves. She organized marches, public protests, and was often beaten, tear-gassed, and arrested by police and put under house arrest several times. This didn't stop her, though. Many people today still go ballistic every time her name is mentioned. She was branded as a traitor, as an American agent trying to malign Pakistan and destroy the country's social and political fabric in the name of women's rights and the rights of non-Muslims. However, for almost 4 decades, she towered over Pakistan's human rights wall. She championed battered wives, rescued teenagers from death row, defended people accused of blasphemy, and sought justice for the victims of honor killings. She often is described as the gutsiest woman that Pakistan ever had. Women during the Prophet Muhammad's time enjoyed freedom and power. So why are women today being relegated to the pre-teachings of Islam? If we're equal in the eyes of God, then why aren't we equal in the eyes of man? It goes back to the decision maker, the person who controls the message, the person who sits at the head of the table, and unfortunately in every single world faith, they are not women. Now, next I'd like to talk a little bit about Hajj. So gender divide can also be seen even when a religious obligation needs to be carried out. Hajj is the annual Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, the holiest city for Muslims. It is a mandatory religious duty for all Muslims, that must be carried out at least once in their lifetime who are physically and financially capable of undertaking the journey and can support their family during their absence. It is one of the 5 pillars of Islam alongside the Shahada, the declaration of faith, Salat, prayer, Zakat, almsgiving, and Sawm, fasting. In order to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, a woman must be occupied by a mahram, which is a male guardian. However, a man can make this pilgrimage by himself. He doesn't need anyone to go with him. Now, all my life, I thought this was religious law, part of the Quran. It was only researching my talk that I found out that there is no mention of a woman being accompanied by a man to Hajj in the Quran. There are 23 references to Hajj in the Quran, and not one of them mention a marham accompanying a woman to Hajj. There are a few so these are a few of the verses that I'm going to read out now. The first one. And proclaim that the people shall observe Hajj pilgrimage. They will come to you walking or riding or various exhaustive means of transportation. They will come from the farthest location. The second one. We rendered the shrine Kaaba a focal point for the people and a safe sanctuary. You may use Abraham's shrine as a prayer house. And finally, you shall observe the complete rites of Hajj. So, none of those quotes that I've just spoken about, a handful of, mention anything about women not being able to go to Hajj by themselves. So why is this the case now? Is mentioned in the hadiths. Okay, so it was narrated by Ibn Abbas, so Muhammad's cousin, that the Prophet said, "No woman should travel except with a marham, and no man should enter upon a woman unless there is a marham with her." A man said, "O Messenger of Allah, I want to go out with such and such an army, and my wife wants to go for Hajj." He said, "Go for Hajj with her." It was also narrated by Abu Hurairah, companion of the Prophet, that the Prophet said, "It is not permissible for a woman who believes in Allah and the last day to travel for the distance of 1 day and 1 night except with her marham." Yet, in another hadith, which was narrated by Abi Ibn, another companion of the Prophet, he said, "Whilst I was with the Prophet, a man came to him and complained of poverty. Then another came and complained about violence. He said, 'O Adi, have you seen Al-Hida?' I said, 'I have not seen it, but I have been told about it.' Now Al-Hida is a place in Iraq. He said, 'If you live a long life, you will see a woman traveling from Al-Hida until she reaches the Kaaba, fearing no one but Allah.' I said, 'And I saw a woman traveling from Al-Hida until she reached the Kaaba, fearing no one but Allah.'" Now from this, we know the traditional rules of the religion do not place such restrictions on women to go to Hajj alone. The Quran does not mention it, and the hadiths are ambiguous, leading many Islamic scholars to argue both sides. However, a woman still cannot travel to Saudi Arabia for Hajj because she will be turned away from the government. Under present Saudi law, any woman under the age of 45 seeking a Hajj visa must travel with a marham, generally related by blood. Women over 45 may travel with an organized group instead, provided they are able to give the Saudi embassy and this is a direct quote from their website, "no objection letter from her husband, son, or brother authorizing her to travel to Hajj with a named group." It is patriarchy that cuts off women performing a compulsory act of being a Muslim. It is patriarchy that treats women as children who need a man's permission to go about their business, even when that business is religious worship. And it's patriarchy that values a woman by her relationship to a man and not as an amudara, a female servant of Allah, an equal in his eyes. Growing up, my parents couldn't quite find the correct balance between their religion, their culture, and their parents' expectations. They didn't want to be ostracized from their community or have their izzat, their respect, talked about. It took some time for them to realize that at the end of the day, they should live their life the best they see fit, the best for themselves and the best for their children. Religious institutions are driven by men and dominated by male leadership, creating policies in their likeness. Our foundations are broken. By challenging the message, we provide an alternative narrative for women's rights. Ala Murhabit did just this when in August 2011 she founded Voice of Libyan Women, the organization which pushes for an inclusive peace process and conflict mediation by shifting the paradigm of women's role in society at both the grassroots and policy level, and is best known for researching women's security, advocating against gender violence, training women to participate in government, and ensuring women are recognized in national policies. And she did all of this by citing the Quran back at the patriarchal society. Those who use religion to justify discrimination against women are using cultural standards, not scriptural standards even. And often these cultural standards existed even before Islam came into being. However, to fight against this it is not easy. One of the major problems with the ability for women to lead in Muslim-majority countries stems from differences in interpretation from the textual foundations for Islam, the Quran and the Hadiths. The problem is intensified by the complexity of the Arabic language, the different sectors of Islam, such as the differences between Sharia law and Sunni Islam, and the Shia Islam and Sunni Islam even, and the differences that occur across the different regions. There is not a singular interpretation of the Quran that defines Islam, and therefore the role of women as leaders cannot be definitively found in the Quran. The role of female leaders is constantly evolving depending on interpretation. Through new modern interpretations from the progressive Islam movement, women have gained more freedom and power as leaders, and through leadership opportunities for Muslim women are cemented in religious texts and continue to expand today. Earlier generations had different understandings of women's roles. Despite modern developments and greater inclusion of Muslim women in political life, there are Muslims who still maintain that the ideal Muslim woman in political should confine herself to the role of mother and wife. There is a completely blurred line between cultural expectations and religious expectations from women in marriage. And over the years, Pakistani expectations have become disguised as Muslim expectations to the advantage of men. Now we come to marriage. In most Pakistani households, a woman in her 30s who is not yet married is the worst kind of evil. A 30-year-old woman collecting dust on the highest shelf with no rishta, meaning proposal, from a potential suitor coming her way. Something must be wrong with her. She is a burden on her parents. Questions inevitably arise. What will become of her? Why are parents sitting back and not alerting the elders so they can fix her up? How will she, God forbid, survive if she remains single for the rest of her life? I still see women pressured into marrying young today, to their first cousin, or worse still, the assumption that if you're not married, that you're a secret lesbian, not pretty enough for marriage, or too outspoken for a man. There is an expectation that you will marry at some point. It might be after your degree, after you've saved enough money, or when you buy your first house. However, the expectation remains. Why is this? Is this cultural? Is this religious? Marriage in Islam is viewed as an important and sacred union between a man and woman that fulfills one half of religious obligations. A well-known passage in the Quran discusses marriage as follows. Among his signs is that he created for you spouses from yourselves so that you might find repose with them, and he has placed between you affection and mercy, in that there are certain signs for people who reflect. Pakistani culture is no different from the Regency period, with customs, morals, and traditions that are considered 200 years old. Marriage is regarded as a culturally and socially approved relationship between a man and woman, and seen as a social institution wherein individuals make a commitment to one another and therefore legitimize a sexual and economical union. 21st century Pakistani culture resembles 19th century English values, and there has been a surge of literature that has been published by British Pakistani and Pakistani authors who have reworked the plot of many Jane Austen novels. Pakistanis prefer Austen to George Eliot's philosophical moralism or Charlotte Bronte's passionate individualism. This is due to the fact Austen restrained propriety translates well into the indigenous Pakistani context, and therefore many Pakistanis can relate to the plot and the themes that occur within Austen's novels. One of these authors, Laleen Sukhera, believes the reason for this is because marriage is the epitome of our society. Jane Austen is not fantasy, we live this life. Aisha Malik's novel, Sophia Khan is Not Obliged, is also evident of this. Sophia, the novel's protagonist, was born and raised in London to Pakistani immigrants and works in a publishing house. The plot centers on her writing a book about the world of Muslim dating at the request of her boss. What ensures is a string of dates for research purposes to find out what dating is like for Muslims in Britain. Sophia's character resembles Elizabeth Bennet's, independent and strong-willed, and she soon finds out that dating a devout Muslim is like dating somebody back in the 19th century. Quote. Her parents are keen for her to settle down, and her mother invites several potential suitors to the house, much to Sophia's chagrin. The most prominent point here is the attitude of her parents' generation compared to her own in finding a partner. This is perfectly illustrated in a piece Sophia writes about the problem about not clicking with people, to which her mother asks, "What is this click?" Explaining to the reader, Sophia underlies the fundamental aspect of second-generation Pakistanis growing up and living in England. She writes, "When our immigrant parents crossed the ocean forevermore, they also crossed certain boundaries of understanding, which, of course, they didn't quite understand." So, is Pakistani heritage important to young British Pakistani Muslims' approaches to marriage? Well, the answer to this is simple, yes. And the reason for this is Pakistan looms large in the lives of many young British Pakistanis. So, is Pakistani heritage still important in young British Pakistani Muslims' approaches to marriage? I spoke to two people who names have changed to young British Pakistani Muslims, and they told me their thought on this. The first woman, who I'll name Hiba, said, "Women are already told about expectations of marriage and what to expect from a very early age. What would your in-laws say? Or what would your mother-in-law say? What would your husband say? Or, you can't do this, you know, that's very embarrassing for me." That kind of thing. So I don't think guys ever got that. Now, women experience Pakistani culture in many different ways, and Hiba is conscious of this in her quote. She's contrasting her own experiences of constant questions and scrutiny with the relative freedom enjoyed by guys. Her rhetorical questions, "What would the older relatives say?" invoke a claustrophobic sense of being hemmed in by Pakistani cultural norms directed more at women than they are at men. The second woman I spoke to, Khadija, said, "Ideally, it's not my cup of tea, I wouldn't," and then she laughed, "but if it has to come to that, then yeah, probably." What she's talking about is she would rather not marry a man from Pakistan, but if she had to, then yes, she would, speaking very light-heartedly of the possibility. She spoke very light-heartedly of this possibility of marrying somebody from Pakistan, a union that would last potentially forever. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about being marriage as a cure in this culture. So Pakistan and Pakistani culture loom large in the lives of many young British Pakistanis, so much so that Muslim girls, implicitly British Pakistani Muslims, are being sent to Pakistan for forced correctional visits arranged for those who fail to conform to the culture. These are not just urban myths. Family and community members sometimes threaten to send their younger, more rebellious counterparts to Pakistan, and in some cases they follow through. Elders arrange a sponsored, punitive, correctional or rehabilitative visit to Pakistan for daughters, and in some cases sons too, whom they see as wayward. Pakistan emerges as a point of reference or a resource to encapsulate everything the woman is saying no to and how by contrast she wishes to live. For example, another woman I spoke to, who I'll call Samia, found a backdrop for projecting the kind of life she wanted to live. Though she, like her mother, had been born and raised in Glasgow, both of her parents, quote, expected her to wear kind of traditional kind of clothing, kind of stay at home, do the house chores, do the kind of traditional things that a woman would be kind of expected to do in Pakistan, unquote. Samia saw this as a gender thing, with its origins in Pakistan, where men are seen above women. Her resilience to these expectations, the work that she was expected to do, and the kind of husband she was expected to take resonates with some things that many other British Pakistani women are saying and are sharing about Pakistani men. In a study conducted by Catherine Charlesy, there's an overwhelming amount of amount of British-born children and grandchildren of Pakistani migrants to Britain, increasingly marrying Pakistani nationals rather than others born and raised in Britain. These marriages are predominantly the first cousin or more distant kin. Why is this? It's to do with fearing the unknown. It may seem like a strange reason, but it's a reason nonetheless. For parents who have migrated to Britain, despite raising their children here, are mainly used to family and friends marrying within the same community and background. Their children considering marriage outside of the community is a new reality and one that is not one that is outside of the norm. This lack of familiarity creates a fear of not knowing or understanding the differences in culture. Every so often, in the minds of many parents, it becomes a case of ensuring that they know that their children are stepping or what their children are stepping into. This is a sense of security in being married into a family with whom one shares similar cultural values and more so. If there were to be difficulties within the marriage, there is hope that the shared values would come into play in order to solve these problems. Marriage is such an integrated form of societal and religious norm. So what happens when you're over 30 and single? So for this, over 30 and being single, how does it feel like? I spoke to 7 women and I'm just going to quote the things that they said about this. So the first woman said, I get asked, do you want to be lonely forever? How much work exactly are you hoping to get done? You're getting old, and the good guys or the choices are running out. Soon you'll have to settle for whatever comes your way. I am relentlessly single shamed. The second woman said, the question, why do you think you're single, makes me feel extremely awkward. I guess people hope that I'll draw out a list of faults that repel men, therein accepting that I am flawed and need to work on myself to be good enough for someone. The fear of being single is fueled by social and cultural expectations. The third woman said, the purpose of a woman's existence is to get married and have kids, and there's a certain timeline to achieve this in. And if you don't by the age of 25, then they start looking down upon you. Next one. In the first 10 years of my life, I was made to believe I'm destined only for marriage. When I was born, my father wanted me to marry my cousin. At 16, I was almost married off to a man who was 32 years old. When speaking about periods as such a taboo, how was I as a daughter supposed to go up to my parents and speak to them about marriage? 5. A year and a half later, my partner divorced me. I had 2 options, either get married again or focus on my career. As a newly divorcee, it was difficult to carry on with life, but with time, the more I succeeded in my career, the more things became easy for me. My friends and family were not happy in the beginning, but gradually they accepted it, and I was not a financial burden on anyone They were fine with me. But at the same time, they kept pushing me to get married again and again, telling me that my life wouldn't be complete if I didn't get married. And finally, I was the first woman in my family to not only work, but move to another city for it. They would say she should be getting married, not getting a job. So, saying this, are independent, single, happy women a threat to patriarchal system of marriage? According to Nisa Kumari, an associate professor of sociology at Lahore University, she says, the pressure on women to marry can be extremely damaging to their self-esteem and sense of self-worth. From a young age, girls are told that they will only be valued in relation to a man, that no matter how much she accomplishes individually, the most important thing is to get a good rishta and settle down, a good rishta meaning a good proposal. For women who resist this, there are several growing number, it is a constant battle against societal norms, inwardly shaming women for being single, by making them feel like failures. Even when friends and relatives do this out of care and concern, this can be damaging. While the main worry in past generations was the financial and economical stability of a woman, many people believe marriage is the only option for women. This is not the case for British Pakistani women. Women are socialized into believing this is the only option for them. They are taught that there is no way out of this cycle. Indeed, it's the only way out of the cycle by getting married to have some freedom. Hence, we often see older women who are unhappy in their marriages impose the same system on their daughters and their daughter-in-laws. And the reason for this is because it stems from the cycle before them. It has been taught by their parents and therefore taught to their daughters. Unfortunately, this pressure of marriage is ingrained so deep in our consciousness that anyone who defies it is deemed a rebel, too westernized, or bringing shame upon the family. Today, men only use culture and twist religion to aid their misogyny, and these double standards are not acceptable anymore, or never were. It's disgusting that men get applauded for their independence and ambition and strong will, yet it's seen as a woman's downfall. It is devastating that we are forced to put our opinions into a box of the past and live as a shadow of what we used to be. Independent, single, and happy women threaten the very foundations of this patriarchal evidence and therefore are extremely threatening. So the Pakistani woman, where does she stand and where is she going? She's going far. Where does she stand today, though? She stands caught between tradition and modernity. But where is she going to go? Far. Very, very far. Why do I talk about this issue? Because I don't have to. I have supportive parents who aren't pressurizing me to marry. Parents who do not now care about cultural and societal norms of Pakistani culture and what they say about us. My grandmother is my inspiration. When my grandfather died in the 1950s, leaving her to raise two small children in a rural village in Pakistan, she decided not to remarry. In fact, she threw a man out in the street, literally, when he came round to propose, and subsequently told her he was doing her a favour in asking a widow to marry him. Instead, she became a potter, selling her work on the street because she built up a business selling her work on the street until she built up her business, acquiring contracts to eventually sell them in shops. I've often wondered how my grandmother, who didn't need any man to survive, and my mother, who shouted at me for being seen outside Rainbow age 14, were even related. However, this is my background, and I'm proud that this is my story. And I stand, or sit rather today, defiantly and boldly against the cultural norms of Pakistani society. I am not the first to do so, and I will not be the last. It's time for women like me and for you to say that, not to use that knowledge to our advantage. They say, why are you not married yet? We say, Khadija was a successful businesswoman who chose to get married when she wanted to. They say, you can't do that because you're a woman. We say, Aisha led a man of armed men into battle. They say women are inferior to men. We say Hawa was not made from Adam's rib. For this to happen, we need to be at that table with the people who are always stationed at the head of it. But if we remain silent, we allow for the continued misrepresentation, misuse, and manipulation that takes place in order for our culture to stay patriarchal. It's not easy challenging distorted religious messaging, believe me, but we have to, for no other reason than reclaiming the message of human rights, the principles of our faith, not for us and not for the women in our families, not even for the women in this country, but for societies that will be transformed with the participation of women, like Pakistan. And the only way we can do that, our only option, is to be and remain at the table. And I'd just like to finish this talk by quoting one of my favorite writers of all time, Maya Angelou. Why do I speak out? Because each time a woman stands up for herself, she stands up for all women. Thank you for listening.